to invite eminent economists, both Dr. Nishan Dimel and Professor Udara Piris, who is joining us online from the US, and to have the corporate sector leaders and think tanks to come together to have an evening of discussion, to have insights and to hear from the experts as to the topic that we wish to discuss today. I, for one, don't subscribe or don't really believe that the stated figure of 12.4 trillion domestic debt as of 30th June is an accurate number. So given that there is so much uncertainty when it comes to everything related to the economy, we'll really be delighted to hear from the experts, get insights, and then we will have a panel discussion where we have invited from the corporate sector and a think tank to share their views, their thoughts as to how we can resurrect or revive this flagging economy. And when it comes to the Q&A, I'll be pleased if you please do feel free to ask as many questions as you want and to share your views, because that will make this event more engaging, more resourceful, and certainly more meaningful. I now have the pleasure of introducing the key presenter for this evening and our respective panelists. The key presenter for the evening is Dr. Nishan Dimel. Needs no introduction, but for formality's sake, Dr. Dimel graduated from Harvard with a degree in economics and has a doctorate in economics from the University of Oxford, where he was a Chevening Scholar. He is the executive director and head of research at Verite Research, a think tank that provides analytical research and advisory services on the economy, political and legal issues in Sri Lanka. He has also served as the executive director of the International Center for Ethnic Studies and on the board of the Sri Lanka Foundation Institute. An economist by profession, he is a member of the Presidential Task Force on the Health Sector and on Tobacco, Alcohol, and Dangerous Drug Regulation, and the National Steering Committee on Social Security. Dr. Dimel has held several governing positions and has lectured in economics at the University of Oxford. Moving on to our panelists, Professor Udara Piris. Professor Udara Piris, who is joining us or who has joined us online, is an associate professor of economics at Oberlin College. He has previously lectured in finance and economics at the LSE and the University of Warwick, respectively. He was a stipendiary lecturer in economics at Oxford. He's a member of the Research Advisory Board of the Central Bank of Russia, and he has co-authored research papers with Professor Goodhart on macroeconomic and financial markets. Professor holds a bachelor's degree in actuarial studies and finance at the University of New South Wales and an MSc and PhD in financial economics from the University of Oxford as a Clarendon Scholar. We have here with us Mr. Timal Pereira. Mr. Pereira is the CEO of DFCC Bank, the chairman of Acuity Partners Group. He has over 2 decades of experience in the financial services sector, both locally and internationally, having worked at HSBC, HNB, the Commercial Bank of Qatar, and Barclays Bank in the UAE. He has held senior management positions throughout most of his career. Mr. Pereira is a chartered accountant and a finalist of CIMA UK. Mr. Pereira is a director of Acuity Partners Group and has over 26 years of banking experience with HSBC, of which 12 years was in the capacity of treasurer and head of global markets for HSBC, Sri Lanka, and Maldives. He was in the senior management cadre at HSBC and served in the executive committee. The will be moderated by Nistar Kasim. Nistar is the editor-in-chief of the DailyFT, and whilst the DailyFT is our media sponsor and the most sought-after newspaper, Nistar is the most sought-after moderator when it comes to events of this nature. So Thank you so much I thank you sincerely for accepting our invitation to be here this evening. And I wish you all a very pleasant evening. Thank you. Dr. Nishan, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for organizing the event and for the introductions and setting the stage for it. Let me first get my presentation up and running. I think I have to do something on that. Excellent. The mic is working? Yeah. So, I'm very pleased to be speaking here today, and thank you for reaching out because when we put together this paper, and Professor Udara Piris, who's the author of the paper, is with us today, we really wanted to communicate to an audience such as this, sort of the banking, financial sector experts who have good reason to be worried, we thought, about domestic restructuring and what line it would take. So my presentation today is simply going to have a two-part structure. I'll have some highlights on debt restructuring, and we'll talk about what we call the desirability of domestic debt restructuring. So often in the banking circles today, when we've talked about debt restructuring, it's been from a position of doom, that this is going to be bad, and how do we mitigate the consequences of domestic debt restructuring, even if it was inevitable. We want to tell you a different story. We want to tell you why even if it were evitable or not inevitable, that it might actually be quite desirable. Desirable not only for the economy of the country, but for the banking sector and a lot of other sectors as well. And the rest of that argument on desirability, or these arguments about why it is the case, will come in the panel discussion. But let me present to you, first of all, the situation in Sri Lanka, the highlights. These are things you know quite well, so I can go through them quite fast. 122% of GDP is the total debt today. That's actually a lot lower than what we thought it would be. By this time, it was tipped to be almost 140%. It's lower because of the very high inflation that Sri Lanka has been running. So Sri Lanka has effectively got rid of a large stock of debt in terms of domestic debt in real terms by inflating the economy and running very high levels of inflation. And therefore, the balance has shifted, right? 70% of this debt, or 70% of GDP in debt is foreign debt, and 51% of GDP in debt is local debt. The relationship used to be inversed, that we had a lot more local debt than foreign debt, but things have changed over time. I'm going to show you a slightly more complicated graph on the profile of Sri Lanka's debt. And what you need to look at is, the comparison between what ISBs and bilaterals have, what treasury bills and treasury bonds have, and others are a mixture of different things. They have multilaterals, they also have SLDBs, etc. Okay. So again, the data right on the corner, just like the last slide, is updated to the creditor briefing that Sri Lanka did. So Sri Lanka actually came out and has to be transparent with creditors. So in a sense, it was an opportunity to have data that is quite updated. And you can see that Sri Lanka's ISBs and bilaterals only account for 31% of total debt, while treasury bills and bonds account for 38% of total debt, even after having inflated them away quite a lot. And overall, still, foreign currency debt is 57, almost 58% of GDP, and local debt is 42. Let me talk a little bit about how countries handle restructuring processes and what are the options. So one option, of course, is to inflate away your debt. If you run very high inflation, that's effectively a way of reducing the real value of the debt. The GDP base grows through inflation, but the nominal debt you have to pay back remains the same. So high inflation is a classic way of dealing with debt. Sri Lanka has already done that to some degree. You can also do what you call standalone external debt restructuring. You will hear me use the term EDR to mean that. You can do standalone domestic debt restructuring. You will hear me say DDR for domestic debt restructuring. You can do some external debt restructuring alongside what we call repressive rules of financial repression in some way. But also you can do a combination of all these things, right? And really often people combine them in some way. And the question for Sri Lanka is, do we want to combine domestic debt restructuring in this process? So let's try to understand, when countries usually get into domestic debt restructuring. This is data from IMF that looks at different regimes. So countries on the left did external debt restructuring only. Countries on the extreme right did domestic debt restructuring only. That also happens. And those in the middle did both. These are just examples. So there are many countries that do it. One of the patterns that you see when you try to understand what is the tipping point for doing both, that one tipping point is the quantity of your debt. So if your total debt is above 80% of GDP, you become on one hand a candidate for domestic debt restructuring. But also if your domestic debt is greater than your external debt, you become a candidate for domestic debt restructuring. And in Sri Lanka, we were qualified under both criteria. Right now, domestic debt as a percentage is a little lower than foreign debt, but it is still close to, quite high. And our debt, certainly total debt, is 122%. So we are certainly in that bracket that should be considering doing both. As I talk about it, you will realize that one of the driving reasons to think about domestic debt restructuring is the cost of interest on domestic debt. Today, and we'll come to the yield curves, which you know about, but even in 2021, the government was having about 73% of interest payment going on domestic debt interest. So when you get into a debt sustainability crisis, when you are borrowing to pay interest, you're adding to your debt stock just to service interest, and that's unsustainable, because if your debt stock keeps growing to service interest, then your debt keeps growing and your interest keeps growing, and it never stops. Okay, so interest is quite important, and the vicious cycle that you can see. I mean, I'll start where we started in March this year. You had a massive depreciation of the currency because there, of course, it was mismanagement. We ran our reserves pretty much to zero. Then that, on the back of that, you get the very high inflation. On the back of that, you get real interest rates become negative. When real interest rates become negative, people decide, well, they don't want to hold the rupee, and they move towards holding dollars, increased demand for dollars, and that, of course, drives depreciation, drives inflation. You're in a vicious cycle. One way to break that cycle would be to divert to the right-hand side and make sure that you have high interest rates to get people to hold the rupee and not depart to the dollar. High interest rates, with government having high local debt, increases the cost of government borrowing and puts you back in a cycle of unsustainability with regard to debt. And when debt becomes unsustainable, you've got to either furnish the money from central bank holdings, which then drives inflation again and this whole cycle all over again, or you declare another debt crisis and another episode of restructuring debt at that point. So the real question for Sri Lanka, which has come down this path, seen it, exited to the right, run very high interest rates, is whether we are going to wait till the burden of the today's yield curve results in another episode of debt restructuring, because that is quite a significant consequence, which is certainly undesirable. And primarily the target of what we are recommending today in the paper written by Udara is that we should break this cycle and get into a new kind of equilibrium, which then prevents Sri Lanka entering another episode of restructure, and that also will mean pulling back the interest rates and not having the problem of government having to refinance domestic debt at unsustainable cost. So I'm going to run through the desirability case for desirability. We have something called the Sri Lanka Economic Policy Group. You recognize the faces on the left. That's Professor Shanta Devarajan, who is part of the president's economic group. He's also retired he was the acting chief economist of the World Bank when he retired. He was actually a chief economist for many regions of the bank. He's still teaching. Mick Moore is somebody who's been engaged with Sri Lanka for a long time, especially on taxation, and runs an institute on taxation in the UK and attached to the universities there as well. That's myself, Professor Dilini Gunawardena, the only chaired professor of Peradeniya University, a specialist in social and welfare economics. And of course, Professor Udara Piris, who's on the screen as well, and who has enormous experience in this area of macroeconomic adjustment and has understood debt restructuring globally as well, and has always been keen to support thinking and responses in Sri Lanka. And I think it has been a great effort on his part to contribute with his analysis. So what does the paper say? The paper says that there are 4 desirable reasons or 4 desirability conditions for domestic debt restructuring. One, and I will go through each of them one by one. I'll just let you read them perhaps for now. I mean, that we'll get to debt sustainability quicker. We'll recover macroeconomic stability, which we don't have. We'll reduce the risk of having another episode of restructuring, and we'll achieve a more equitable distribution of costs in the economy. Well, how do we propose to restructure debt? This must be $1 million question. The paper works with some assumptions. We say, let's assume that external debt is restructured by getting a 50% principal cut on all bonds, ISBs and SLDBs. And multilaterals also take a haircut of 25%, and along with bilaterals. Now, it doesn't have to be exactly like that, but the sum total of the cut on the bonds and multilaterals and bilaterals must add up to an equivalent of what we are saying here, right? So you can get the ISBs to take a 60% perhaps, and we certainly should be negotiating in that direction. I think Sri Lanka needs to make sure that it is not asking for too little from the external debt holders. And then, of course, multilaterals will take that 25% cut in a different way sometimes. They will take with very long reprofiling. And how you treat SLDBs, a lot of conversion of SLDBs to rupees is going on, and that may be another way to adjust it. But if we manage this, and if we do the domestic debt restructuring early, we can contain the problem, break out of that vicious cycle by simply reprofiling domestic debt by 10 years, so no haircuts. We push back capital repayment by 10 years, and that seems to do the trick. All the math is available on the website, and I'll give you a QR code from which to download it at the end of my presentation. Okay, so we are not only sharing with you a paper, we are sharing with you all the Excel sheets with all the data, the functions, the model that Udara has done. So that, this is something you don't have to take anybody's word for it. You all are highly specialized financial analysts. You can put it to test, right, and see whether it works out or not. We think it does. So let me go through the 4 reasons quite quickly, and I'll keep an eye on time. The first, it provides a quicker path to debt sustainability and economic recovery. So we run the model on the assumptions that I'm telling you. This is how much we cut external debt. This is and this is the reprofiling of domestic debt. Well, now currently, if business continues as usual, okay, and there's no restructuring happening right now, we are still going to recover some in terms of reducing debt because of the very high inflation rates we've run and will continue to run for the next year. But debt is going to remain at this level in the medium term. So there is no escape, right? At this level, debt needs to be restructured. We can't re-enter borrowing with international financial markets. So this is without any restructuring at all up to 2025, medium term. This is what happens if you do EDR, external debt restructuring only. Okay. And there, uh, so that's the purple line. By 2025, you can get your debt to GDP to about 100%. And this is kind of what the government is banking on and claiming that it's able to do, and thinks that that's good enough to get it over the wall into better climes and times for the economy. And this is what you get with a reprofiling of domestic debt by 10 years. You get a little over an 11% reduction in debt to GDP to 92, a lot healthier level. So the fact is that actually you get to under 100 so much faster. You get there in 2023 rather than in 2025, which means that the economy can re-enter debt markets, can create confidence, can attract investment a lot faster if you run that domestic debt restructuring piece. Because even though you get to 94, when people see that it's going back to 99, you're not judged as being as good or credible or certain. But with a domestic restructure, you can fix it at 92 and hold it there, and that is a huge advantage because time is extremely costly. The longer Sri Lanka delays in getting its debt restructuring done, the more it hurts investment, the more it hurts economic growth, and all these hurt debt sustainability as well. So we are in a vicious spiral, and delay doesn't help us. Moving fast does help quite a bit, and this reprofiling gets us there faster. Second reason, it provides a foundation for recovering macroeconomic stability. You have seen the yield curves and how they have shot up. So what you see at the bottom is the yield curves in December 2019, March 2022, just before the crash where the yield curves were, and then the yield curves as they are today, right? Government trying to refinance itself at these yield curves are extremely difficult and unsustainable. And within these yield curves, we also have extremely high inflation rates, which of course is encouraging the central bank to then run high interest rates as well. The purple line, these are our projections that we did. They may or may not work out. The purple line is if there was zero inflation month on month after July. The black boxes are how it actually turned out. The red boxes are what we have projected it to be. And there's a certain formula for our projections. All to say that expecting inflation to come down a great deal too quickly is perhaps not easy to justify in terms of an analytical thought process. Central bank's own projections, I must tell you, are a little more optimistic than ours. So they expect it to come down a little faster, but they still expect average annualized interest next year to be about 29.5%, right? So it's still quite high. Now, while people have often critiqued, I've heard criticisms of the current governor saying that he has printed more money than the previous governor, and without using personalities, if he just asked, well, how much money has been printed in the last 12 months, it's ₹1 trillion. Or by printed, we mean that central bank has added to its balance sheet of government debt directly, where it's lent to government directly. The situation is even more problematic than that. The central bank has not only increased its balance sheet to government by $1 trillion and taken it to $2.3 trillion, but it has also funded the private market, and many of you here, to lend to government with a premium of about 10 to 12%, right? So that's another 600 billion on top. So effectively, the problem is that the government is so much in need to refinance itself that the old idea that printing money drives inflation, and if you stop printing money, it doesn't create inflation. High interest rates allow you to do that. You have to think that the tail is wagging the dog today. The causality is reversed. Government spending is the driver of inflation. With that level of spending, there's no way to continue unless you declare government to be bankrupt or not paying its bills without having to get the money from somewhere. And central bank, if the private market can't produce it, because here you go, uh, the government need for credit has entirely crowded out the private sector. There's no money to borrow it, and it's too expensive. Even at 30% plus interest rates, the government can't get enough money unless the central bank supplies it. And so what you see is that the blue line, that all this money that the central bank is putting out is not ending up in business growth or future investment. It's going to meet the bills of government and going to meet the bills for refinancing government debt as well. So unsurprisingly, growth is projected to be negative 9.2% now. And there's no way out of this cycle until, I say, the cookie monster, who's eating all the cookies of credit, is actually paused, and there's some cookies left for the rest of the country. But you can't give others cookies as long as the cookie monster needs them. And the cookie monster needs more and more, because as it eats the cookies, there's a 30% hunger factor that's growing. It's getting hungry by 30% every time. And so it has to ask for even more cookies. And this vicious cycle keeps going, right? So we have to find a way to break it. And this is why we're coming up with a solution. So central bank has these kinds of, medium-term goals, but how do you achieve these goals when more and more of the debt portfolio of government is getting refinanced at 30% or yields of close to 30%, and there is no way to break that cycle, right? So that's why domestic debt restructuring provides, we say, a foundation for recovering macro stability. The way we see it is this: in the episode of a domestic debt restructure, you suddenly reduce the need to refinance maturing bonds. So we are not talking about bills. We are only talking about bonds being reprofiled. Bills are so short term, you pay them back. But there are plenty of bonds that are coming up, long-term bonds and 5-year bonds, 3-year bonds. So the sooner you do it, the better. And when you stop the need to refinance and roll over that debt, you can actually begin to reduce interest rates. Then you reduce your need for money. When you reduce your need for money, you reduce inflation, feedback in the economy. You try to reverse that cycle down in some way. So the third desirability condition is that we reduce the risk of returning to another debt restructuring episode in the medium term. Okay. So now I'm stretching the graph I showed you over a longer term, not medium term, over time. You can see that without external debt restructuring, or without any restructuring, though you may take a dip here, you will see that debt grows to 154% of GDP by 2032. Even with external restructuring, there's the model, we are running the math on it. We see external debt growing to 136% of GDP in the next 10 years. At current yields, okay? So as long as the yields are what they are. So the problem is that these yields don't create a sustainability mechanism for Sri Lanka's debt. But even at these yields, you can bring debt to 101% of GDP by 2032 if you did the reprofiling. But the real kicker, or the benefit of a reprofiling, is that you can bring yields down on the back of a reprofile. And when you do that, you change the whole network, and you can actually bring debt down to below 80% of GDP on the back of having yields redoing your yield structure back to 2019 levels. Those are not extremely low, but they're significantly low. So the real trick in domestic debt restructuring is not not some haircut the government gives you to reduce the debt. The real trick is that it reduces the hunger of the cookie monster, is able then to have the market not drive up interest rates, and interest rates are getting driven up for more than one reason. One, because there's a hunger that can't be satiated. Two, because there's more and more uncertainty. The more hungry the cookie monster becomes, the more uncertain you are that you are going to survive its onslaught. Which is why you have a gap of more than 10% between the rates at which people are borrowing from the central bank and giving to government. Now, that you'd think that should get competed away, but it isn't. because the level of uncertainty in the market is so high that the premiums are extremely high as well. And you can put all that to bed with a restructure. So the value of the restructure is not some kind of saving the government makes on debt, but actually the resetting of the dynamics of the economy to lower yields and to confidence and investment that follows from that. This is Trebesh and Cruz, the paper, the sort of two of the writers that publish a lot on debt restructuring. They show that in 1970 to 220, that on average, countries that went through a debt sustainability period or episode had to restructure twice. Okay, that means half of them restructured twice, and half of them got away doing it once. Well, not half of them twice. Half of them did it. Some of them did it 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 times even. So you can have, restructuring can become a chronic problem if not dealt with properly. If your restructuring is too shallow, too optimistic, too lazy, you don't end up with one restructuring. You end up with 3, 4, 5, 6, right? But those who do it well know how to do it deeply, take the cuts early, do it quickly and deeply, is how you end up with one. So Sri Lanka must not only, I think, do it deeply, that's with external debt, and domestic debt adds to the depth of the restructure, but also do it quickly. There is no time to be lost in this process, because the longer you wait, the more at risk you are of repeating this process ahead. And the fact that this is the case in lots of other countries should be sobering. So domestic debt restructuring finally reduces the risk of returning to another episode of debt crisis that we have had. The last point I want to make is that it also can potentially achieve a more targeted and progressive sharing of the adjustment burden. So this is how the debt is distributed amongst different holders. Of course, the EPF has rather a lot, but the EPF doesn't mark to market necessarily its payouts. So reprofiling doesn't necessarily impact hugely what it pays those who have saved. The EPF has already lost a great deal in the inflation, right? So people have already paid a price. Domestic debt restructuring doesn't add hugely to that price. High interest rates could help the EPF because government pays for it, but people will pay for those high interest rates through their taxes and through inflation anyway. So it doesn't really solve the problem for workers. But just to go through, if you want to manage domestic debt, you can continue to increase taxes. So that's another way that the government doesn't borrow so much. You can keep running high inflation, so you reduce the real value of your stock. You can artificially set lower yields. Okay, and I'm on the right-hand side, I'm discussing what we say in the paper, the consequences of all of those, right? First is regressive on wage earning middle class and population with increasing poverty. Second is also reduces real wages and again hurts the savings of the middle class. Third one hurts savings deposit holders and fuels inflation, which is regressive. So the moment you do a repressive, lowering of yield, you'll find people exiting the rupee and having depreciation, having inflation come back to you. Whereas a restructuring can allow you to be fairly targeted in the way you shift the burden. And actually, it can also be a win-win, because you are asking the question, if I reprofile, even with a reprofile, the asset value of my capital value goes down. The net present value is reduced significantly by a reprofile. But if a reprofile achieves for you a lower yield curve, actually it's not clear that it goes down. It could even go up. So this reprofile is not just a reprofile. It is triggering then a reduction in your discount rates. And when it gets a reduction on your discount rates, you're going to actually see your bank balance sheets improve potentially. Because today you may still see them improve with regulatory forbearance, but that's not a real improvement. You can improve them for real if the discount rates came down on your future, on your holdings and your cash flows for the future. So you may give some, but you get some. And that's really the way to approach this problem. So let me end, because I think my half an hour is just up. They don't want me to end. It refuses to move to the next slide. Are you able to do it for me? Okay. So this is the fourth idea. And so here's the thing. You can move early to reprofile your domestic debt, which is what we are recommending. Or if you delay it, the problem, of course, the longer you wait, this is just like the debt suspension now. And government thought, no, too worried, too scared, too uncertain, waited, delayed, and of course got yourself into a deeper crisis, right? Stitch in time saves 9. So you delay it, you probably can't just get away with a reprofile. You probably have to look at haircuts on domestic debt also. You do neither. You may still be able to get away. So we are not saying it's inevitable. You may still coast along for a little while, and then you end up with a repeat debt sustainability crisis in the next 7 years. So here are the choices for Sri Lanka as we see it. We can move early to head off what might be a much harder problem a few years later, or even a much more severe problem 5, 6, 7 years later, if we don't find a method to break the vicious cycle and put the yield curves back in a place where government debt can be sustainable. And this is the paper, that's the QR code. To get into the site and also get you the data and the functions and the model so that you can test it for yourself. Okay, so I know Udara is not doing the main talk today. He should have been, but we are glad to have him on the panel and we look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
For more latest news, subscribe to FTTV.